So we are rounding up economic growth and potential growth. So today we're talking about the importance of productivity for the rate of economic growth. So we know what productivity is already. Output in relative to input, that is productivity. And when you talk about rate of economic growth rate, we're talking about the measures and changes in the economic output. So you are measuring changes that has occurred in your output as an economy. That is what the rate of economic growth is. Economic growth means output is increasing, but the rate is talking about the changes in economy, a change in economy's output. That is what growth rate is. I think it's clear. So here they said actual economic growth with no corresponding potential growth will push production closer to PPM. So we have our PPM, which is the combination of what can be produced if all resources are fully utilized. So if the economy is in its actual growth, it means whatever it does, without any corresponding potential growth, it simply means whatever the economy produces is only walking through the boundaries, is about to reach the boundary. That is what actual growth is about. The actual growth means the economy has unused resources. The economy has not reached its full potential. That is what actual growth is. So here they said, actual economic growth with no corresponding potential growth will push production closer to PPF. It will push it to the PPF. That is, we are still in PPF 1. So this implies that for the real GDP to increase, the PPF will have to shift outward. So if we're talking about the real GDP, for it to improve, it means our PPF and the long-run aggregate supply curve must shift rightward and outward. Do you get the point I'm making here? We have our actual GDP or our actual growth, economic growth, which means we are still operating within the PPF. But for us to talk about potential growth, it means the economy is growing, which simply means there's an outward shift in the PPF or there's a rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. I think the point is clear there. So one of the key factors that causes potential growth is an increase in productivity. So the topic is about the importance of productivity for the rate of economic growth. So if economy has to grow, if the output has to increase, one of the factors that would increase output is the productivity. So when you talk about productivity, like I told you earlier, it simply talks about those things that we put together that we process to give us our production. So that means output divided by input. So we're talking about the factors of production. Simply, we're talking about the factors of production. So productivity can be increased through the quality of factors of production, such as improving the skills of workers or technological advancement. So because productivity is important to the rate of economic growth, it means for the PPF to shift outward or for the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift rightward, we have to increase productivity. So how do we increase or improve productivity? We can increase productivity through improving the skills of the workforce. That is human capital. We talked about human capital before. Human capital are those values that we add to production. So with improving skills of workers, that would increase the level of output within the economy. So that means labor productivity is expected to rise. So that's the first point. So if labor productivity is increasing, it will definitely affect the rate of economic growth. That's the first one. The second one is technological advancement. That means we are investing in capital goods. So the quality of capital goods can also influence or impact on the rate of economic growth. So those are ways in which productivity is important to the rate of economic growth. So how do we now increase productivity itself? We can increase productivity, like we talked earlier, through capital and through labor. Labor is through improving the skills or training and education. And for capital, it means we have to invest more in technology. I think the point is clear. Another way to increase productivity is we're not trying to buy or invest in technology. Rather, we are improving the existing factors of production. So when we are able to invest, when we are able to improve the efficiency of existing factors of production, it means we are doing things in a better way. So that would also increase productivity. So yeah, it would also an increase in the efficiency on the existing factors of production will bring about increases in productivity. So for productivity to increase, we need to either invest in technology or improve the skills of our workers. If we invest in technology, it increases capital productivity. If we invest in workers, it improves labor productivity. So either ways, the economic growth rate will be impacted or will be influenced with the rate or with an increase in productivity. Therefore, to increase the trend growth rate, we need to increase productivity. So for us to increase the rate of economic growth, we have to increase productivity. And to increase productivity, we have to invest in workers and in technology, or we improve the efficiency of, or we improve the methods in which we use existing factors of production. So that is why productivity is important to the rate of economic growth. I think that one is clear. Clear, right? Great. So the next one is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is also, you know what aggregate demand is, right? Aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus export minus import. That's what aggregate demand is. So aggregate demand is also an important aspect for the rate of economic growth. So here I wrote, the total demand in an economy may increase the productive potential of any given economy. For example, a rise in export will initially increase aggregate demand rather than aggregate supply. Export is a component of aggregate demand, yes or no? So that means if export is increasing, it affects aggregate demand more than aggregate supply. I think the point is clear there. So, however, a permanent in exports, all other things being equal, will force aggregate demand, will force exporting firms to invest in equipment and lead to a rise in the demand for labor to satisfy the increased demand. So the first point about aggregate demand is that if export is increasing, so there's a permanent increase in exportation. So it simply means that exporting firms would not have any other choice than to increase the numbers of their workers to meet up with the increasing demand for their exports. Yes or no? So this will in turn increase investment, which will lead to a rise in productive potential of the economy, which will in turn impact on economic growth rate. So it is an increase in exports becomes an incentive for exporting firms to increase the numbers of their employees to meet up with that increasing demand, because they have to satisfy consumers, their foreign customers. They have to satisfy them, and to satisfy them means they make goods available for them at any point in time. So that would mean that exporting firms will invest further. Yes or no? Yeah. So increase in investment would increase aggregate demand, because investment is also a component of aggregate demand. So if it means export is increasing, investment is going to increase as well. And that would definitely increase the economic growth rate. The economy will grow. The potential of the economy will reach its full potential because exporting is increasing. If export is increasing, aggregate demand is increasing. As a result of that, as soon as aggregate demand increases, firms will have the incentive to produce more. So to produce more, to satisfy the needs of customers, they have to employ more workers. Do you understand how it works? Yeah. So note, some economists also argue that increase in aggregate demand in general through investment may impact on aggregate supply. For instance, when an economy goes into moderate recession, firms cut investment. This reduces output. Lower sales can also means firms will have less cash available to use for investment. If the economy bounces back, firms will tend to overinvest in the next boom, making up for their loss of investment in the recession. However, a prolonged recession will lead to hysteresis, as there will be permanent loss of human and physical capital. So, some economists argue that increase in aggregate demand or increase in investment would definitely increase aggregate supply. So, which simply means if there is a moderate recession within the economy, a moderate one, that means a recession that is not that high, that it's a short-term recession. If it happens, firms will cut their spending anyway. They will cut their investment. And if they cut their investment, it means output will reduce. It affects supply. Yes or no? So as soon as the economy comes back to recovery in the next boom, those firms, because it's a temporary recession, those firms that have cut their investment will now invest further. And because they invest further, output will increase, which means supply side aggregate supply would also increase. On the other hand, the point is we should understand that an increase in aggregate demand will also increase aggregate supply. That is the point they're making there. So they are using recession as a yardstick for us to understand that if aggregate demand increases, aggregate supply is supposed to increase. So if we have a permanent or a prolonged recession. For a prolonged recession, it simply means aggregate demand would fall, definitely. And because aggregate demand will fall, it will affect the supply side of the economy too. Because both human capital and physical capital would reduce.
Okay.
Do you understand? So it simply means we would never talk about aggregate demand without relating it to aggregate supply. Because if there is recession, if there's a moderate recession, there will be cut in investment, and a cut in investment affects supply side of the economy. If there is a prolonged recession, it brings about hysteresis, which affects both human and physical capital. I think the point is clear. Then what happens if we have or a recession for more than a decade? So I said, what about if recession lasts for more than a decade? This will result in a high rate of unemployment. Now, we've talked about a temporary recession. We've talked about a prolonged recession. Now we're talking about a recession that has lasted for more than 10 years, going to 20 years. This will also affect the supply side. And how? This will result in a high rate of unemployment, because if with recession, aggregate demand would fall permanently, drastically. So if it falls, unemployment is expected to rise, yes or no? So that will bring about a high rate of unemployment. So supply side economists would argue that these short side supply side reforms, this shows that supply side reforms need to be implemented in the labor market. So if there is a long-term recession, which is lasting for more than 10 years, more than decades. So it simply means that there should be a reform in the supply side of the economy, because the supply side of the economy is in the labor market. So what are they trying to say? They are trying to let us understand that if recession continues to persist over time, it will affect aggregate supply. So definitely there's need for supply side reform through the labor market. So what kind of supply side reform can be done to ensure that the unemployment rate that is increasing due to a long-term recession reduces? So one supply side reform should be reducing the rights of workers. So when government reduces the right of workers, it allows employers to employ more workers, because it simply means that workers do not have the same right like they used to have. So look at what I wrote here. I said, this could be true. Okay, yes.
What do you mean by rights of workers?
Workers have their rights, like
Which are?
discrimination or unfair dismissal. All these things are rights of workers. So if workers are dismissed unfairly, they have the right to go through the court, the court of arbitration for labor, to reinstate them to the trade union. But this means workers have more power than employers. So because of this reason, employers might not want to employ more workers. And now that the recession is very high, the recession is taking longer than expected, unemployment will continue to rise. So for firms to have the incentive to employ during this long-term recession, it means they have power over workers. That will make it easier for them to employ. That is the point. You get it?
Yes.
So here I wrote, this could be through reducing workers' rights in areas such as the ability of employers to sack workers. It's difficult to sack workers. But if workers' rights is reduced, it means employers have power over them. So that means they can hire and fire at any point in time. That gives them the incentive to want to employ more workers during that long-term recession. Does it make sense to you? So now, the supply side reform has been done. It will solve the problem of reduced aggregate demand. Do you get it? So, now this side. This will encourage employers to take more workers and so solve the problem of unemployment. So if unemployment has to be resolved during a long-term recession, it simply means there should be a reform. Going back to checking on where workers have edge over employers, which now we have to cut it off to make employers have edge over workers. That would encourage them to employ more workers, and that would reduce unemployment. It's likely to reduce unemployment. Does it make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, great. So other economists would argue that there will be no extra jobs if aggregate demand remains depressed. Therefore, government policies of fiscal austerity, there's fiscal austerity, which simply means government increasing taxes, government cutting public spending, because there is or because they want to improve deficit, or they want to, because the economy is in crisis. These are what we call fiscal austerities. Government has to stop that, because if government doesn't stop it, aggregate demand will continue to fall. Do you get it? For the supply side economists, they believe that if there is a long-term recession, supply side reforms have to be put in place to reduce the power of employees, so that employers have more power over them, more edge over them. That would encourage employers to employ more workers. That will solve the problem of unemployment. That's the first aspect. Then other economists believe that if aggregate demand continues to be depressed, that means it's continue to fall. Government has to find a way to reduce its fiscal austerity, which simply means the cutting of government spending should be stopped or should be reduced. Government should start reducing or cutting or an increase in tax should be reduced, because if not, those things would continue to affect aggregate demand. Because if there's fiscal austerity, it simply means government feel that its account is on deficit, is running on deficit. Then if government is running on deficit, it means to improve its deficit, government has to cut spending, public spending, government has to increase taxes. And these two things will affect aggregate demand. Do you understand? So for the economy to move outside, or for the economy to, to improve, to recover in a long-term recession, the government has to cut down all fiscal austerity, because that would encourage aggregate demand, or that would increase aggregate demand. That is for other economists. For supply side, they only said government should reform supply side, government should come up with supply side reform, which will give employers more power over employees. So those are the two ways in which aggregate demand and aggregate supply have relationship when it comes to increasing the rate of economic growth. I think the point is clear about that. Any question about it? Good. So we go on to
No, we did this page.
no, increasing aggregate demand. No. So these 32. Okay, yeah, we did. So we're going to the four distinctions, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So four distinctions now. When we talk about four distinctions, we're simply talking about understanding the rate of economic growth through the GDP, and how will GDP have impact when we are measuring the rate of economic growth rate. So yeah, the economic growth is typically measured by the rate of change of output. We talked about that earlier. So therefore, when measuring GDP, four important distinctions should be made. The first one is for economic growth itself. If we are measuring economic growth, we don't measure it with the nominal GDP. We measure it with
Real GDP.
the real GDP, which means GDP that has been adjusted for inflation.
Inflation.
So that will give us the real value of the rate of change in the economy. That's the first point. The second one is real GDP as an indirect measure to represent the volume of goods and services produced. So real GDP can also be a proxy. And when we talk about real GDP, we're talking about the GDP that has been adjusted for inflation. So it's also an indirect way to measure the volume of goods and services that has been produced. So here I wrote, real GDP is a proxy measure used to represent the volume of goods and services produced. This can be done by taking the nominal value of GDP by dividing it by the price level. So we can as well use our nominal GDP. But when we are using our nominal GDP, we have to divide it with the price level at the current price level. So that means the nominal GDP divided by the current price level will still give us our real GDP. So that means the nominal GDP divided by the price level is a proxy to measuring real GDP. So if you don't want to measure real GDP, if you don't want to use adjustment for inflation, the price level is an adjustment, because the current price level the current price level will be compared with the previous price. So the difference between the current price and the previous price tells us the rate of inflation. So that's why they said real GDP is a proxy to measuring the volume of goods and services produced in a given economy. Do you get it?
Yes.
Real GDP means we have adjusted the GDP for inflation. But if we don't want to use that, we can use the nominal GDP by dividing it with the price level. And when we talk about the price level, we're talking about the difference between the current price and the previous price. So the difference between the current price and the previous price will allow us to know if there's inflation or not within the economy. I think the point is clear. The third one is total GDP. And when we talk about total GDP, is the total amount of GDP produced within a given economy. So We can't continue to talk about the total amount of GDP produced without understanding the population, without understanding how it has impact on individuals within the economy. So if we have to measure it with individuals within the economy, it means we have to use GDP per capita.
Capital.
And that is GDP divided by the population. I think it's clear.
Yeah.
So if we are doing that, it means we want to check the rate of growth of the economy with the living standard. So the economy should not just be growing without having impact in the way people live. And to understand the impact it has in the way people live, we have to measure it based on the population.
It's on the capital. Yeah.
So that is GDP divided by population. I think the point is clear.
Mhm.
And the last one,
Falling economy.
falling economic growth. Falling economic growth does not mean that the level of real GDP itself is falling, because falling rate of growth implies that GDP is not rising as fast as before. A falling rate of growth is not that, it doesn't mean that the real GDP is falling, because the real GDP is measured by how things go over time. So if there's a falling rate of growth, this only means that the GDP of that economy is not growing as fast as it was previously. That is what it means. So I think the point of economic growth, falling economic growth, is clear. Economic growth measures the output within the economy. It doesn't mean that the real GDP of the economy is falling. If it falls, if the economic growth rate is falling, it only talks about the changes in output. It doesn't talk about the real GDP itself. So what we need to understand is that when we are measuring the growth rate of an economy, it is important for us to distinguish between the GDP and the rate of growth of GDP. The rate of growth of GDP is meant from the real GDP. The rate of growth talks about changes in output over time. And the real GDP is talking about the output of that economy, which has been adjusted with inflation. So the economy can grow slowly based on different situations, but doesn't mean that the economy is not growing. So it just simply tells us that the rate at which it's growing is not as it was before.
Mhm.
So that ends economic growth and output gaps. Any question?
No.
Thank you.